September 1944. Arracourt, Lorraine. Fog lies low over beet fields while Panthers prowl with confidence their long 75s hunting for easy kills. Then something impossible happens. American Shermans' supposedly clumsy death machines pivot like a flock. Orders cut through engine howls as if the noise isn't there. Platoons change direction mid-burst. Artillery lands where a voice just pointed. P-47s arrive on a grid spoken seconds earlier. German crews fire true and still get outmaneuvered by tanks that seem to think together. The secret isn't thicker armor or a bigger gun. It's invisible humming inside steel racks. The battlefield's deadliest weapon is a conversation. In the early war narrative, the Axis felt certain the arithmetic favored them. German crews trained hard behind superior optics, excellent gunnery, and disciplined radio procedure concentrated at command echelons. Panthers entered service with speed punch, and the aura of a predator quality defeats quantity, the staff officers said, and many battle reports seemed to agree. On paper, American armor looked ordinary slab-sided Shermans with a short 75 gasoline engine's green crews. The stereotype wrote itself loud, numerous, and tactically naive, but confidence became tunnel vision. The German net AM heavy precious sets rationed to key leaders worked well in rehearsed plans and clean weather. It struggled inside armored chaos ignition noise, overlapping transmissions units intermixing in fog. Platoon leaders often fell back on hand signals and runners when things turned fluid. Meanwhile, the Americans quietly standardized something different, frequency-modulated sets at the tactical edge net discipline, drilled until brevity words felt like reflex. From North Africa to Italy, lessons hardened into habit. By France, a Sherman platoon didn't hunt as 4 tanks. It hunted as one organism tied to artillery and air by voice. The Axis expected duels of steel. What arrived in Lorraine was a lattice of sound they couldn't jam, predict, or outrun. They didn't start by underestimating American courage. They started by overestimating arithmetic. If quality always buries quantity, then the German calculus in 1943-44 felt safe. A Panther, with a long 75 fine optics and a trained gunner, should beat a Sherman in any honest duel. The lesson of the early desert fighting seemed to prove it. American armor rushed forward, took hard knocks. The nickname Ronson circulated not because every Sherman ignited, but because enough burned under the right hits to create a myth with teeth. Myths thrive when a few vivid images stand in for 1,000 invisible variables. On paper, American tanks looked ordinary. The early 75mm lacked the shock value of German high-velocity rounds. Armor protection varied by model. Gasoline engines fed the bias that U.S. hulls were tinderboxes. German crews noted the Sherman's high silhouette, its busy 5-man choreography, and a gyro stabilizer they assumed couldn't possibly matter under real fire. They examined knocked-out vehicles and concluded that American design doctrine was naive, too simple, too standardized, too trusting, that training and logistics could redeem hardware that wasn't best in class at the point of impact. Tactics reinforced the sneer. American units in North Africa showed uneven radio discipline. Nets clogged reports, overlapped runners still carried crucial messages. To a panzer officer drilled on tight procedures and centralized control, U.S. chatter sounded like amateur hour. German sets, though fewer at the platoon edge, were handled by professionals who prized brevity and hierarchy. The impression hardened. Even if Americans had radios everywhere, they didn't know how to shut up and fight. Better one clear command than a dozen cross-talking voices. Doctrine gaps appeared to favor Germany too. The Wehrmacht cultivated gunnery excellence and camouflage. They used terrain and first-shot lethality to turn duels into executions. U.S. forces, meanwhile, seemed to telegraph intent: long columns on roads, predictable pivots around villages, an almost industrial rhythm to attacks that any veteran could read. German instructors taught that American armor was brave but blunt. Once you blooded the lead elements, they would hesitate, reform, and hand you time. And time is the cruelest weapon. So the Axis mocked what they thought they saw. They mocked the shorter gun. They mocked the silhouette. They mocked the noise, the gasoline, the assembly line tank built by a people who mistook mass for mastery. Most of all, they mocked the radios, so many sets, so much undisciplined talk, so little evidence to their eyes that the ether could win a battle. They believed radios belonged with commanders, not crews, that platoon leaders should watch flags and hands, not juggle headsets under fire. They believed interference would strangle any attempt to coordinate at speed. And because they didn't live inside an American net, they never felt what an FM lattice could do when it was trained into muscle memory. What they missed was that American ordinariness hid an organism. Standardization wasn't poverty, it was strategy. 1,000 similar hulls meant 1,000 predictable workspaces for the same radio racks, the same intercom boxes, the same mounting rails and power supplies. Training didn't reset at every turret. Muscle memory transferred. Maintenance didn't reinvent the harness. Spares snapped into place. And when crew after crew learns the same brevity words, the same call and acknowledge cadence, the battlefield stops being a set of duels and becomes a conversation with consequences. From a distance, a duel still looks like a duel. Up close, the weak tank edges the angle it wants because a wingman whispers a bearing, because a battery answers with grid precision in seconds, because a flight of fighter bombers is already orbiting on another net, waiting for one coordinate. The axis aimed at the wrong center of gravity. They prepared to beat steel. The thing they needed to beat was time, and the Americans had decided to manufacture time in boxes of olive drab with dials and handsets drilled into the hands of men who now thought in radio. For all the later confidence, the Allied problem began as a wound you could not film lost minutes. In Tunisia and the Italian Hills units bled opportunities because orders arrived late, grids were garbled, and enemy thrusts outran headquarters maps. Tanks hesitated at hedgerows while runners sprinted. Batteries waited on corrections that died somewhere between a company CP and a gun line. In the spaces where a modern army wins or loses the 10 seconds before a corner, the 30 seconds after first contact, American formations discovered they were rich in machines, but poor in shared awareness. The battlefield's noise made it worse. Engines howled. Ignitions spat static. Tracks screamed. In that thunder, amplitude-modulated sets serviceable in a quiet drill yard carried as much hiss as meaning when multiple voices keyed at once. Meanwhile, the very strength of the U.S. Army, its size, amplified the penalty of delay. If one platoon missed a cue, a lane closed. If one battery waited a minute, a flank collapsed somewhere else. Each fix, more runners, more flags, more prearranged plans, stole agility to buy control. And even then, the plan broke the moment the enemy did the unexpected. The cost in France would be higher. Hedgerows shattered sightlines. Fog in Lorraine turned maps into guesses. German counterattacks with Panthers could not be parried by heroics alone. They had to be managed at the speed of surprise. What the Americans needed was not a new gun first, nor a thicker plate. They needed a weapon that made decisions travel, a weapon that turned 5 tanks into one mind and tied that mind to artillery and air without a staff meeting. So the requirement hardened push voice down the chain. Make it clearer under worst-case noise. Standardize it so training scales. Discipline it so the net doesn't drown itself. In other words, build a tactical nervous system. That meant frequency-modulated sets ruggedized for armor, SCR 508-528 family, standardized mounts and power FT-237-24V, dynamotors, intercom boxes that let crews fight while hearing, and a brevity lexicon that cut sentences into triggers. It meant every platoon leader talks often, every tank commander, and liaison radios stitched together artillery observers, recon jeeps, and air-ground controllers into a web that survives chaos. The urgency was not theoretical. After-action reports from North Africa and Italy repeated the same verdict: contact reports too slow, counterfire late, air support mistimed by minutes that might as well be miles. In Normandy, the hedgerow maze punished any force that couldn't synchronize in motion. And in Lorraine, the Germans would bring massed armor and weather to break lines apart. The Allied secret weapon could not be a single vehicle or shell. It had to be an invisible architecture, taught, installed, rehearsed so completely that a platoon could change its plan mid-burst without colliding. That is why the Signal Corps and Armored Force treated radios as organs, not accessories. Factories cut steel for tanks and crated racks for radios on the same schedules. Schools drilled net discipline until acknowledgments were reflex. Maps were redrawn for grids spoken, not just printed, and air-ground procedures matured from ad hoc brilliance into repeatable choreography. You could swap a knocked-out hull and keep the conversation alive. You could lose a commander and not lose the thread. Call it a doctrine of manufactured tempo. The Americans chose to build time as deliberately as they built tanks. In doing so, they answered the central problem of modern battle: how to remain a single will after first contact. The secret weapon was never a secret to the men installing mounts, soldering harnesses, or memorizing call signs. But to an enemy who measured war by steel alone, it might as well have been magic. The day the lattice held under fire, minutes stopped leaking. And when minutes stopped leaking, battles changed shape. They hid the breakthrough in plain sight, under olive-drab lids in steel racks that smelled of dust and hot varnish. Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, had been a nervous system for American communications since the interwar years, a place where the Signal Corps learned to think in electricity and timing and doctrine. Here, labs that once sketched out wire and sound ranging quietly turned to the problem that kept killing minutes at the front: get clear voice to the men who decide battles despite engine howl, ignition hash, and overlapping transmissions. The answer would be a family of frequency-modulated sets hardened for armored war, and it would be pushed down to the platoon edge on purpose. Industry met intent. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant and Albert Kahn Cathedral, to speed and scale, was already proving that standardized spaces could swallow standardized equipment without drama. If every turret bustle expected a radio rack, and every rack expected the same power and mounts, then training and maintenance would compound like interest. Radios would stop being delicate add-ons and become organs. You could swap a hull and keep the conversation alive. The set that embodied the bet was the SCR 508, standardized July 1941, designed for armored command and control, replacing the earlier SCR 245 lineage. It wasn't designed to talk to the world. It was designed to talk right now across short ranges with enough clarity that a platoon leader could change a plan mid-burst without colliding. The choice of FM with crystal-controlled channels was philosophy disguised as hardware favor, intelligibility, and discipline over raw reach. Favor predictable, repeatable nets over improvisation. By 1944, that philosophy had crawled out of manuals and into muscle memory. Security wrapped the work. New channels were planned on paper that never left certain rooms. Training syllabi taught brevity as if it were a weapon. The sets themselves carried their own kind of secrecy, pre-selected crystal positions behind guarded panels, channel selectors that could be changed in the dark without hunting a dial. The men who installed FT-237 mounts and dynamotors weren't chasing glamour. They were building a nervous system, one power lead, one antenna relay, one intercom bus at a time. A tank school instructor at Fort Knox might tell a class that gyros and radios together make average crews faster than aces. The lesson stuck, because the hardware made it true. The innovation wasn't only electrical, it was organizational. Doctrine deliberately redistributed voice platoon leaders, with sets often every tank commander with a headset. Artillery liaison officers with their own nets. Recon jeeps that could whisper a grid to guns and armor in the same breath. Air-ground controllers who could speak fighter and tanker without translation. What had been episodic genius in North Africa became routine choreography by Italy, and by France, routine felt like destiny. Where a German company commander might hold the only reliable set in a fight, an American platoon could improvise at speed, because every node could say the thing that mattered and be heard. And in the background, industry kept pace. Chrysler built hulls at a rhythm the staff could trust. Communications suppliers filled crates with the same modules, BC603 receivers, BC604 transmitters that installation teams recognized on site. The chain from lab to line of departure shortened until the new way of fighting barely felt new. It simply felt connected. When the fog lay on Lorraine and Panthers rolled in with the assurance of duelists, the real duel had been scheduled years earlier on benches at Fort Monmouth and floors in Detroit. The impossible idea wasn't a miracle chip or a single wizard's spark. It was a choice to manufacture tempo and to protect that choice with secrecy training and standardization until it could not be undone. The enemy would see the tanks. They would not see the conversation that moved inside them. And that precisely was the point. Open a BC604 transmitter, and the argument is right there in metal and glass. Rows of crystals pre-select channels so a commander doesn't hunt with a smooth dial while the world explodes. A channel strip marks 10 presets each, a promise that a call sign on the net will answer in the next breath. Power is no afterthought. Dynamotors step tank voltage to the high tensions, vacuum tubes crave, and the FT-237 mount ties power antenna relay and intercom into a single swappable spine. A field tech can trace the harness by memory because the harness is the same everywhere. The physics that matter here are not mysticism. They are FM behavior under armored noise. In AM information rides on signal amplitude, exactly the dimension most polluted by engines, magnetos, and the electrical violence of tanks firing on the move. Stack multiple AM voices in the same neighborhood, and they blend into a wash of heterodynes and hiss. FM shifts the burden to frequency deviation. The receiver's limiter crushes amplitude variations the battlefield's hiss, while the discriminator reconstructs voice from changes in frequency. The result to a man wearing headphones in a Sherman is not silence but intelligibility when it counts. In a Storm FM is a ruthless editor. Signal Corps training and histories hammered this contrast for a reason. Doctrine made the physics lethal. Nets were layered. A platoon net carried contact bearings and immediate maneuvers. A company or battalion net braided those calls into short orders. Artillery nets on their own frequencies listened for the hail that mattered and answered in grids, fuses, and seconds. Air-ground circuits lived apart, but remained within reach so a liaison could bridge armor to fighters when a road needed to stop being a road. The hardware's clarity made brevity possible. The brevity made speed feel safe. Technically, the SCR 508 family lived in the 20-28 MHz neighborhood, trading long-range reach for short-range reliability and whip antenna practicality on moving armor. The point was never to talk over the horizon. The point was to talk through smoke. Crystal control killed drift, stabilized nets, and let commanders pre-plan channel plans that survived chaos. By 1944, American armored units weren't just equipped. They were trained around this lattice so that acknowledgments and corrections moved like reflex arcs. Contrast mattered. German Fuji sets good radios in their own right leaned AM and were rationed by doctrine and production, often leaving platoon-level leaders to hands and runners once chaos arrived. That economy worked well under rehearsed plans. It withered when fog and engine noise conspired. Even when German commanders had clean sets, a single voice trying to manage multiple fights across AM nets would drown. In American practice, a dozen FM voices could speak briefly without destroying comprehension because the system expected them to. Security and resilience were engineered too. Preset channels reduced on-air fumbling and shortened net change chaos. Intercom integration meant crews could fight while talking. No one had to choose between the gun and the order. Modularity let maintenance swap a sick box without rewiring a tank. Standard racks ensured that any replacement fit. Factories reinforced all of this by shipping identical modules by the crate, and plants like Detroit Arsenal made sure the steel that carried the radios arrived in floods. The invisible edge only works if it is everywhere. So when observers later wrote that artillery won Arracourt, or that fighter bombers turned the tide, they were not wrong, just incomplete. Someone had to ask in time, and someone had to be heard. The secret sauce was a chain FM physics that reject noise, crystal discipline that resists drift, mounts and power that make installs repeatable, doctrine that pushes voice downward, training that turns procedure into instinct, industry that fills every bustle with the same heartbeat. The Axis never figured out how to kill that chain in the minutes that mattered. And minutes in armored war are the deadliest caliber of all. Dawn creeps over Lorraine as a gray sheet, the kind of fog that makes maps lie. East of Arracourt, the beet fields hold their breath. Hedgerows bead with moisture. Engines tick like caged animals. In that hush, American platoons fan out along lanes they can't quite see, each hull a node in a nervous system that hums awake the instant a commander squeezes his throat mic. The orders aren't shouted. They're spoken short, clean, confident writing, frequency-modulated voice that shrugs at ignition howl and turret recoil. The plan is modest probe, feel, refuse any duel you don't own, and keep the conversation alive. The day's date, September 1944, will matter later. For now, the only calendar is tempo, measured in seconds between a bearing called and a turret turning. The Germans come as duelists, panthers stepping into the fog, with a predator's certainty. They expect a straight trade armor and gunnery against a Sherman's thin chest. The first contact is a thud and a flash, a long 75 reaching out through milk-white air. But the target has already shifted. Break right 2 lengths on me. A wingman answers before the sentence lands. The platoon net stitches movement into shape. One tank holds a corner, another slides to a flanking ditch. A third whispers grid for artillery already listening. In the background, a liaison's voice climbs a different ladder, calling up to a battery that knows this ground by number, and then sideways to an orbiting fighter-bomber flight, waiting for a road to become a target. None of this is dramatic. It isn't meant to be. It's the quiet violence of timing manufactured and spent. Through the morning, the fog cuts both ways. German formations struggle to stay knitted, fresh crews misread lanes and without platoon edge radios to keep every claw attached. Thrusts become fingers, then isolated knuckles. When they hit hard. But each thrust is met by an American unit that refuses to be a row of individual tanks. A contact report doesn't go to a distant brain. It fans across a company net, where a captain can redirect 2 platoons in the time it takes a runner to clear a hedgerow. Fire missions arrive with frightening neatness. Corrections come in seconds. When weather lifts, P-47s pounce on roads that voices marked minutes earlier. What looks from the ridge like improvisation is choreography that's been rehearsed since North Africa and written into doctrine by Italy. The enemy can see the Sherman hulls. He cannot see the lattice that moves them. By midday, wrecks pattern the fields in shapes that don't make sense to an eye trained on duel geometry. Panthers die not to single showdowns, but to angles someone else created a field away. A tank destroyer section appears where no one expected, because a net change and a bearing put it there faster than a map could. Artillery seems psychic. It isn't. It's a battery on its own net waiting for a single disciplined hail. In the lulls, crews breathe, wipe goggles, and check the channel strip 1 digit. That means you're still on the same page as every other man trying to stay alive. The secret is not a miracle gun. It's the ability to change the plan while moving without colliding. Toward evening, the fog lifts just enough to show the shape of the day. The Germans have bled strength into the hedgerows. American lines flex but don't break, then snap forward by yards that matter. The radio racks are warm to the touch. The intercom buzzes with the tired banter of men who have learned to think out loud. A platoon leader notes the strangest sensation: fear without chaos. He has heard the worst already and answered it because he didn't have to wait to be brave. When reports march up the chain, a picture emerges that will become history near Arracourt. In late September 1944, U.S. armored forces beat back superior German guns, not by winning fair fights, but by refusing them, talking faster than the enemy could decide, turning seconds into weapons. The realization doesn't arrive as a speech. It arrives as a pause, one German commander keying his handset and hearing only hiss where a platoon should be. It arrives as a Panther reaching a crossroads alone, the rest of its company smeared across fog and fields by small errors that radios at the edge could have erased. It arrives as artillery that seems to guess as fighter bombers that respond to an invisible hand as Shermans that appear at the right hedge at the wrong time. When a round claps the air and a gunner swears he had the angle, the American he was hunting is already somewhere else, guided by a sentence that slipped under the noise. He is not losing to a better machine. He is losing to a conversation he can't hear. What begins as confusion curdles into dread. Reports fragment. The fog feels sentient, a thing that edits German orders while letting American ones pass. Attempts to centralize control only thicken the jam. AM nets choke as multiple voices stack heterodynes, hissing like snakes. Platoon leaders fall back on hand signals and habit. Runners vanish into hedgerows that give them back too late. There is no grand Allied secret being broadcast. There is a discipline of preset channels, crystal-locked stability and brevity that turns chatter into triggers. The effect is cumulative. One platoon moves before it's flanked. One battery fires before a threat coheres. One flight strikes before a road becomes a line of battle. Keep adding before, and eventually, the outcome flips. By afternoon, the German frame for the fight collapses. They came to trade virtues, armor, and optics for speed and numbers, and discovered they were trading against time itself. Panthers that should dominate open ground instead blunder into kill boxes registered by a voice 2 minutes ago. Attacks meant to be hammer blows land as scattered taps across a front that bends and flows like water around stones. The American pattern is infuriating, never present where a perfect shot expects, always present where a plan needs one more hull. Seen from above, the U.S. force fights as an organism. Felt up close, it fights like an ambush that keeps moving. They're everywhere, someone says, but the truth is tighter they are together. And still, the Germans fire well. Individual duels go their way often enough to keep hope alive until that hope is erased by something happening off stage. A second platoon redirected a battery shifting sheaf, a liaison bridging to aircraft that peel the skin off a column at the worst possible moment. The American edge is not omniscience. It is response time trained until it looks like prophecy. A commander who can change a maneuver mid-sentence is a different kind of threat than one who must finish a paragraph before the first tank moves. When night leans in, the field is a diagram of hard lessons. Wrecks mark where German courage met American tempo and lost. Survivors sift for an explanation that feels fair. Better tanks, no. Trick maps, no. Somewhere between those answers is the shape of an invisible enemy, the lattice that made average crews fast and good crews surgical. The last transmissions of the day sound weary on both sides, but only one side speaks as if the net itself is a refuge, a place where fear is metabolized into orders. In the weeks to come, staff histories will file numbers, memoirs will chase heroics. The men who were there will remember something else the moment they understood the battlefield had another dimension sound made useful, and that the side who owned it could turn minutes into steel. Near Arracourt, late September 1944, that truth became impossible to ignore. The long view begins with a simple admission: once voice could move at the speed of a decision, the shape of Allied warfare changed. A Sherman platoon with FM wasn't just 4 tanks. It was a decision loop that stayed intact under noise, shock, and movement. Scale that up, companies braid into battalions, battalions into combat commands. Artillery engineers and fighter bombers plug into side nets that answer in seconds, not minutes. The effect wasn't cosmetic. It rewrote what mass meant. Not just more machines in one place, but more coordinated machines arriving at the right place with the right task before the enemy had finished deciding what was happening. Axis planning assumptions so carefully built around first-shot lethality, ambush geometry, and the duel aged out almost overnight in France and Lorraine. The duel still existed, but it no longer decided campaigns because the Americans refused to let duels stand alone. If one crew faltered, another crew's sentence filled the gap. If one lane closed, a radioed bearing opened a new one. If a counterattack materialized from fog, a battery answered from a net already warm. German formations that rationed tactical radios to leaders could deliver beautiful scripted blows, but when the fog hedgerows and Allied tempo shredded the script, the lack of platoon edge voice turned local setbacks into operational drift. Industry amplified doctrine. Standard mounts and crystal sets meant every new hull arrived with the same nervous system. Training reproduced the same reflexes in crews who had never met. This is the part the enemy could not out-engineer in time. Even a perfect new tank cannot pull a fragmented net back together. Even an ace commander cannot speak through static to leaders who don't have sets. Meanwhile, American staffs learned to treat time as inventory budgeted in pre-planned channel tables, brevity lexicons, and rehearsed net changes that made on-the-fly retasking feel safe. The result was a force that could improvise at speed without disintegrating. Air-ground cooperation, long romanticized as thunderbolts arriving on cue, settled into a repeatable craft because the craft had a wireframe, armored leaders who knew which net to hail, liaisons who translated grids into attack runs, pilots conditioned to hear that hail and answer with ordnance inside the minute. Artillery, so often described as the king of battle, wore a new crown only because radio made its scepter reach. Fire without fast correction is noise. With fast correction, it's surgery. The post-Normandy tempo made German counterstrokes feel like punches thrown underwater, brave, sometimes brutal, but too slow to land in combination. Strategically, the FM lattice pushed the U.S. Army toward a style of warfare the The Axis could not copy at scale distributed initiative with reliable coherence. You could trust subordinate leaders to shape fights because you could still talk to them while they did it. They could trust higher headquarters to help because help guns engineers' aircraft could be summoned by voice without an appointment. The old binary quality versus quantity gave way to a third axis connectivity. And along that axis, American decisions compounded like interest, while Axis decisions paid cash each time. By war's end, the ledger was plain. A doctrine that treated radios as organs, not accessories, made large formations behave like a single will in weather fog and shock. The Panther remained a superb duelist. The problem was that the war had stopped being a tournament. It had become a conversation with consequences, and only one side owned the grammar. When the archives finally opened, and the men who had survived were old enough to speak without performance, a pattern emerged in their language. The technical compliments were cautious. Americans did not field the heaviest gun or the thickest armor, the Germans would say. But the coordination was unnerving, mechanical, as if their units were one machine. Staff recollections circled the same dilemma. You could ambush an American company and hurt it badly. And yet before the shock finished expanding, something else arrived, another platoon, from an angle you had not graphed, a battery whose first bracket felt like prophecy, a flight you could not see 10 minutes ago. It was not luck. It was latency beaten down to seconds. Post-war engineers. Some of them the same men who had once dissected captured Shermans with contempt rewrote their memos in a cooler hand. They praised American standardization because standardization made radios ubiquitous. They noted that frequency-modulated voice under engine noise was not a gimmick, but a physics choice aligned to an armored reality. They conceded that when voice penetrates, the chaos doctrine can risk decentralization without courting collapse. The bitterest compliment hid in their operational studies plans, predicated on paralyzing enemy headquarters, proved insufficient against an army whose head was everywhere the net could reach. The human admissions cut deepest. Tank commanders remembered trying to hold a crossroads with nothing but hand signals and nerve while static clawed at their ears. They remembered hearing in captured headsets crisp sentences that sounded like calm in the middle of a catastrophe. They remembered the feel of being outdecided by people who were not necessarily better shots or braver men, just faster together. In the moral math of veterans, that may be the hardest thing to confess, that your courage was not enough to outrun the other side's time. What remains after the numbers and diagrams are tallied is a sentence no tribunal needed to compel "we lost" to an enemy who talked while he moved, and the talking made the moving smarter. If there is wisdom in defeat, it is this: armor without a nervous system is muscle without a mind. In Lorraine, in hedgerows and fog, the mind won.